The first time I walked down Soi 6 in Pattaya, I told myself I was just being a good friend. James had been going through a rough divorce back in Manchester, and this trip to Thailand was supposed to be his chance to forget, to heal, to remember what it felt like to smile again. I was the responsible one, the married one, the one who would make sure he didn't do anything too stupid while he worked through his pain. That's the story I told myself, anyway. That's the lie that made it easier to book the flight, to tell my wife Sarah I was helping a friend in need, to pack my bags with the righteous feeling of someone doing a good deed. But standing there in the neon-soaked chaos of that narrow street, with its pulsing music and the sweet smell of street food mixing with cheaper perfume and cigarette smoke, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the obvious attraction to the young women calling out from the bars, though that was certainly there. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was the intoxicating rush of being wanted, of being seen as desirable, of stepping into a world where my thinning hair and expanding waistline didn't matter, where my boring job in accounting and my stale marriage were irrelevant details from another universe. James disappeared into one of the bars almost immediately, drawn like a moth to the flame he'd been seeking since we landed. I told myself I would just have one drink, just keep an eye on him, just make sure he was safe. But as I sat at the bar nursing my Chang beer, watching the easy interaction between the working girls and their customers, I began to understand something that would change everything. This wasn't just about sex, though that was certainly part of it. This was about feeling significant again, about being the center of someone's attention, about experiencing a kind of validation that had been slowly leaking out of my life for years without my even realizing it was gone. Her name was Nim, or at least that's what she told me. She was probably 22, with long black hair and a smile that seemed genuine even though I knew it was practiced. She sat beside me without invitation but without aggression, ordering herself a lady drink and asking me about England in accented English that was charming rather than difficult to understand. For the first time in months, maybe years, I found myself talking about my life, not as a series of complaints or obligations, but as stories that might actually interest someone. She laughed at my jokes, touched my arm when she spoke, looked directly into my eyes as if what I was saying mattered to her. I know how this sounds. I know how naive and pathetic it appears from the outside. A middle-aged man being flattered by a young woman who was paid to be interested in him. But in that moment, sitting in that dimly lit bar with the music washing over us and her attention focused entirely on me, it felt real. More real than the perfunctory conversations I had with Sarah about bills and schedules and whose turn it was to take out the bins. More real than the polite small talk with colleagues who saw me as just another face in the office. More real than anything I'd experienced in so long that I'd forgotten what genuine connection could feel like. When she suggested we go upstairs to one of the rooms above the bar, I should have said no. I should have remembered my wedding vows, my responsibilities, the life I'd built back home. Instead, I found myself nodding, pulling out my wallet, following her up a narrow staircase to a small room with a bed and a sink and nothing else. What happened there wasn't just physical, though the physical aspect was more intense and passionate than anything I'd experienced in years. It was emotional in a way that caught me completely off guard. She made me feel desired, powerful, interesting. She made me feel like the man I used to be, or maybe the man I'd always wanted to be but never quite managed to become. Afterward, as I walked back to the hotel in the humid Thai night, I told myself it was a one-time thing. A mistake, maybe, but an understandable one given the circumstances. James was getting what he needed to heal from his divorce, and I had simply gotten caught up in the moment. It wouldn't happen again. I would go back to being the responsible friend, the faithful husband, the boring accountant who paid his taxes on time and never caused any trouble for anyone. But the next night, I found myself making excuses to return to Soi 6. James wanted to try a different bar, and I was just being supportive. I wasn't looking for Nim specifically, I told myself. I was just curious about the other establishments, just wanting to understand this world that seemed so foreign, yet strangely appealing. When I did see her again, sitting at the same bar as the night before, the smile she gave me felt like recognition, like genuine pleasure at seeing me again. She remembered details from our conversation the previous evening, asked about things I'd mentioned, made me feel like I'd left an impression that mattered to her. This time, when we went upstairs, it felt less like a transaction and more like a reunion. She seemed more relaxed, more affectionate, more genuinely interested in pleasing me. We talked afterward, lying in the narrow bed in that small room, and she told me about her family in Isan, about the rice farm that barely provided enough income to survive, about her younger brother who was smart enough for university if only they could afford the fees. Her story broke my heart and made me feel important at the same time. Here was someone who needed me, who could benefit from my help, who saw me as a solution rather than a problem. Over the remaining days of that trip, I found myself spending more and more time on Soi 6. Less and less time playing the role of responsible chaperone to James. He was having his own adventures and didn't seem to need or want my supervision. I was free to explore this new world, to discover this new version of myself that felt more authentic than the man I'd been for the past decade. Nim and I developed what felt like a relationship, complete with inside jokes and shared experiences, and the kind of easy intimacy that I'd been missing from my marriage for longer than I cared to admit. When it came time to leave Thailand, I felt like I was being torn away from something precious. Nim cried when I said goodbye, and whether those tears were genuine or professional, they felt real to me. She gave me her phone number, made me promise to stay in touch, to come back soon. I promised both things, meaning them completely in that moment, even as part of my mind was already beginning to construct the walls that would separate this experience from my real life back home. The flight back to Manchester was torture. Not because of guilt, though that was certainly present, but because of loss. I felt like I was leaving behind the best version of myself, returning to a life that suddenly seemed grey and meaningless by comparison. Sarah picked me up at the airport, asking polite questions about the trip, commenting I looked rested and relaxed. I told her the standard stories about temples and beaches and helping James work through his problems, but all I could think about was the way Nim had looked at me, the way she'd made me feel important and desired and alive. The first few weeks back home were an exercise in compartmentalization. I threw myself into work, tried to reconnect with Sarah, attempted to slip back into the routine of my previous life. But everything felt different now. The conversations with my wife seemed more superficial than before, the daily grind of office life more tedious, the entire structure of my existence more like a prison than a home. I found myself thinking about Nim constantly, wondering what she was doing, whether she was thinking about me, when I might be able to see her again. I started texting her, just friendly messages at first, asking how she was, telling her about my boring life in England. She responded enthusiastically, sending photos of herself, telling me she missed me, asking when I would come back to Thailand. These conversations became the highlight of my days, the secret pleasure that made everything else bearable. I would wake up early to check for messages from her, stay up late to chat when it was daytime in Thailand, find excuses to step away from work or family obligations to maintain this connection that felt more real than anything else in my life. The money started small. She mentioned that her brother needed books for school, and I sent £50 through Western Union without thinking twice about it. It felt good to help, to be needed, to solve problems with the financial resources that seemed so abundant from my English perspective. When her father got sick and needed medicine, I sent more. When the rice harvest was poor and the family was struggling, I sent more still. Each transfer felt like an investment in our relationship, proof that I cared about her and her family, evidence that I was a good man doing good things for someone who truly needed help. Sarah noticed the money going missing, of course. Not immediately, but eventually. I had stories prepared about helping James with his financial problems, about investments that hadn't paid off, about unexpected expenses at work. She believed me, or at least she didn't challenge the explanations directly. Our marriage had settled into a pattern of polite coexistence where difficult questions were avoided and uncomfortable truths were left unspoken. In some ways, this made my deception easier, but it also made me feel more isolated, more justified in seeking connection elsewhere. 6 months after that first trip, I booked another flight to Thailand. This time I went alone, telling Sarah that James needed support for some legal issues related to his divorce. The lie came so easily that it frightened me, but not enough to stop me from boarding the plane. I told myself this would be closure, a chance to see Nim one more time and then move on with my life. I would help her family with their immediate problems, enjoy a brief holiday, and then return to England with this chapter of my life properly concluded. But the moment I saw her waiting for me at the airport in Bangkok, holding a sign with my name written in careful English letters, I knew I was lying to myself. The smile on her face, the way she ran toward me and threw her arms around my neck, the genuine joy in her voice as she said my name. It all felt like coming home in a way that my actual home never did. We took the bus to Pattaya together, her hand in mine, talking and laughing like lovers reunited after a long separation. For those few hours, I allowed myself to believe that this was real, that what we had transcended the circumstances of how we met, that love could bloom in the most unlikely places. The week I spent with her was the happiest I'd been in years. We didn't spend all our time in the bars of Soi 6. She showed me parts of Thailand that tourists rarely see, took me to meet some of her friends, introduced me to foods I'd never tried and experiences I'd never imagined. We went to temples together, walked on beaches, sat in small restaurants eating somtam and drinking beer while she taught me basic Thai phrases, and I told her stories about England that made her laugh. It felt like a real relationship, like the beginning of something that could last. Of course, it wasn't free. Beyond the money I gave her directly, there were the expenses of taking her away from work, of paying for our meals and activities, of buying gifts for her family and friends. I told myself these were normal relationship expenses, the kind of thing any man would do for a woman he cared about. The amount seemed reasonable when converted from pounds to baht, and the joy on her face when I handed her money or bought her things felt worth any cost. But as that week progressed, I began to notice things that disturbed me. The way she checked her phone constantly, even when we were together. The friends who would appear suddenly and need to borrow money for various emergencies. The stories about family problems that always seemed to require financial solutions. The subtle but persistent requests for help with expenses that seemed to multiply daily. I found myself saying yes to everything, partly because I could afford it, and partly because saying no felt like risking the loss of something I'd come to depend on emotionally. When I returned to England after that second trip, the depression was worse than before. The contrast between the life I'd experienced in Thailand and the life I had to live in Manchester felt unbearable. Sarah seemed more distant than ever, work felt more meaningless, the entire structure of my existence felt like a cage that was slowly suffocating me. I increased my communication with Nim, sending longer messages, making more frequent phone calls, transferring money more regularly. It became a daily ritual, this connection to a life that felt more authentic than my actual life. The third trip happened just 4 months later. I was running out of believable excuses for Sarah, running low on easily accessible funds, and beginning to realize that my behavior was becoming compulsive rather than rational. But I couldn't stop myself. The anticipation of seeing Nim again, of feeling wanted and important and alive, was the only thing that made my daily existence tolerable. I took money from our joint savings account, telling Sarah it was for a business investment that would pay dividends later. The lie felt heavier this time, more consequential, but not heavy enough to stop me from boarding the plane. This trip was different from the first two. Nim seemed more distant, more focused on extracting money than on building our relationship. She had new problems that required immediate financial solutions, new friends who needed help, new emergencies that couldn't wait. I found myself spending more time alone while she dealt with various crises, more money on situations that seemed increasingly suspicious, more energy trying to recapture the feeling of connection that had brought me back to Thailand in the first place. But even as part of my mind began to recognize the patterns, to see the manipulation and calculation behind her behavior, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. The alternative was returning to a life that felt empty and meaningless, admitting that I'd been fooled, acknowledging that the most intense relationship I'd experienced in years was built on lies and exploitation. It was easier to keep paying, keep believing, keep hoping that if I just gave enough, loved enough, proved myself enough, the genuine connection I craved would eventually emerge. The money became a serious problem. What had started as small gifts and occasional help had evolved into a regular stream of payments that were draining my savings and threatening my financial stability. I took a second mortgage on our house, telling Sarah it was to consolidate debt and reduce our monthly payments. I borrowed money from friends, claiming various investment opportunities and personal emergencies. I even took advances on credit cards, justifying the high interest rates as temporary measures until my next bonus or promotion came through. Each financial decision felt reasonable in isolation, but together they were creating a house of cards that couldn't stand indefinitely. I was spending more money on my trips to Thailand and my support of Nim's various needs than I was earning from my job. The mathematics were unsustainable, but mathematics felt less important than the emotional mathematics of maintaining the only relationship that made me feel truly alive. Sarah began asking more direct questions about our finances, about my frequent trips, about my increasingly secretive behavior. I became defensive and angry, accusing her of not trusting me, of not supporting my efforts to help a friend in need, of being jealous of my newfound happiness and confidence. These arguments felt justified at the time, but looking back, I can see how cruel and manipulative my behavior had become. I was gaslighting my wife, lying to my friends, deceiving everyone who cared about me in order to maintain a fantasy that was consuming my life. The fourth trip to Thailand was when everything began to unravel completely. Nim had moved to a different bar, claiming she needed better working conditions and higher earnings to support her family's growing needs. When I arrived at our usual meeting place, she wasn't there. It took me 2 days to track her down, and when I finally found her, she was with another man, an older German who seemed to be playing the same role I'd been playing for the past year. She was polite, but distant when she saw me, explaining that she had to work, that she couldn't spend time with me unless I was willing to pay the same rates as any other customer. The illusion shattered completely in that moment. I realized that everything I'd believed about our relationship, every emotion I'd invested in our connection, every financial sacrifice I'd made for her benefit, had been part of a carefully constructed performance designed to extract as much money as possible from lonely, vulnerable men like myself. I wasn't special to her. I wasn't different from the dozens or hundreds of other customers who had probably heard the same stories, received the same attention, felt the same false intimacy that had seemed so real to me. But even with this devastating realization, I couldn't bring myself to leave Thailand immediately. I spent the rest of that week in a kind of desperate denial, visiting different bars, looking for something that would restore the feeling I'd lost, trying to recapture the magic that had made me feel so alive. I spent money recklessly, pursuing experiences that felt hollow and meaningless, attempting to fill a void that had grown larger rather than smaller with each failed encounter. When I returned to England after that fourth trip, I was financially ruined and emotionally destroyed. The money I'd spent in Thailand had been discovered by Sarah, who had been conducting her own investigation into our disappearing savings and my suspicious behaviour. She had found the Western Union transfers, the credit card advances, the second mortgage documents, all the evidence of my financial deception laid out in careful detail. She had also found some of my communications with Nim, enough to understand exactly what kind of relationship I'd been pursuing and paying for. The confrontation was devastating. Sarah's anger and hurt were overwhelming, but worse was her disappointment. Her sense of betrayal, not just by my infidelity, but by my lies, my financial recklessness, my complete disregard for our shared future and mutual trust. She had trusted me with our financial security, our emotional intimacy, our life together, and I had gambled it all away for a fantasy that had never been real in the first place. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Sarah kept the house, most of our remaining assets, and custody of our financial future. I was left with debt, shame, and the crushing realization that I had destroyed everything meaningful in my life for something that had never existed. The money I'd sent to Thailand was gone forever, invested in a relationship that had been purely transactional from the beginning. The emotional connection I'd craved had been an illusion, carefully crafted to separate me from my resources and my sanity. But even knowing all of this, even facing the complete destruction of my life in England, I found myself planning another trip to Thailand. The addiction wasn't just to the sex or the attention or the feeling of being wanted. It was to the escape from reality, the temporary relief from the consequences of my choices, the brief respite from the shame and regret that now defined my existence. Thailand had become a drug, and like any addict, I was willing to sacrifice everything for one more hit, one more chance to feel something other than the crushing weight of my failures. The fifth trip was funded by borrowing money from my brother, telling him I needed help getting back on my feet after the divorce. I promised to pay him back within 6 months, knowing even as I made the promise that it was probably a lie. I had no plan for recovery, no strategy for rebuilding my life, no intention of addressing the underlying problems that had led me to this point. I just knew that I couldn't face another day in the grey reality of my post-divorce existence without the promise of escape that Thailand represented. This trip was the worst yet. Without the illusion of a special relationship with Nim to sustain me, I was just another sex tourist, moving from bar to bar, paying for temporary companionship that felt increasingly hollow and meaningless. The women I met were professional and efficient, providing the services I paid for without pretense of deeper connection. The experiences I'd once found thrilling and validating now felt mechanical and depressing, but I couldn't stop pursuing them because they were the only relief I had from the constant anxiety and self-loathing that had become my default emotional state. I stayed in Thailand for 3 weeks, spending money I didn't have on experiences that left me feeling worse rather than better. I drank too much, slept too little, and made increasingly desperate attempts to recapture something that had never been real in the first place. By the time I returned to England, I was physically ill, emotionally exhausted, and deeper in debt than ever before. The money I'd borrowed from my brother was gone, along with the last remnants of my family relationships and personal dignity. The rock bottom moment came 6 months later, when I found myself seriously considering selling my mother's engagement ring to fund another trip to Thailand. The ring was the only thing of value I had left, the only connection to a family that had largely written me off as a lost cause. Sitting in a pawn shop in Manchester, holding that small circle of gold and diamonds that represented decades of love and commitment between my parents, I finally understood what I had become. I was a man who would sacrifice anything, betray anyone, destroy everything meaningful in his life for the temporary escape that had become his only source of relief from unbearable reality. I walked out of that pawn shop without selling the ring, but not because I had found the strength to resist my addiction. I walked out because the pawnbroker's offer was insultingly low, not enough to fund the kind of trip I was planning. It was a moment of clarity that terrified me more than any of the financial or emotional devastation I'd experienced up to that point. I realized that I was willing to sell my mother's ring, but only if the price was right. The moral boundary I thought I would never cross had already been crossed in my mind. I was just negotiating the terms. That night, alone in the small flat I'd rented after the divorce, surrounded by the debris of my former life, I finally admitted to myself that I needed help. Not financial help, though that was certainly true. Not relationship help, though my ability to form genuine connections had been severely damaged by my experiences. I needed help with the addiction that had consumed my life, the compulsive behavior that had driven me to sacrifice everything meaningful for something that had never been real. The road to recovery was long and difficult, filled with setbacks and moments of weakness when the urge to escape back to Thailand felt overwhelming. I attended support groups for sex addiction, worked with therapists who specialized in compulsive behavior, and slowly began to understand the underlying emotional needs that had made me so vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. The loneliness, the need for validation, the desire to feel important and desired. These were normal human needs that I had tried to meet in the most destructive way possible. Learning to meet these needs in healthy ways, to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect and authentic connection, to find meaning and purpose in my life that didn't depend on the approval or attention of others. This became the real work of recovery. It was harder than anything I'd ever done, more challenging than rebuilding my finances or repairing my family relationships or finding a way to live with the shame of what I'd done to myself and others. But slowly, gradually, with the help of people who understood addiction and the support of others who had walked similar paths, I began to rebuild a life that felt authentic and sustainable. I learned to recognize the triggers that had driven my compulsive behavior, to develop healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with loneliness and stress, to find sources of validation and connection that didn't require me to pay for the privilege or sacrifice my integrity to maintain. The journey back from the depths of sex addiction in Thailand taught me that the human capacity for self-deception is almost unlimited, that the need for connection and validation can drive us to make choices that seem impossible to understand from the outside, and that recovery requires not just stopping the destructive behavior, but addressing the underlying needs that made that behavior feel necessary in the first place. It's a lesson I carry with me every day, a reminder of how quickly a life can unravel when we mistake fantasy for reality and allow our deepest needs to be exploited by those who profit from our vulnerability. The aftermath of my experience with Dr. Moth, Hartwell extended far beyond the immediate shock of discovery. In the weeks that followed, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about human connection and professional boundaries. The psychological impact was profound. I had invested so much emotional energy in what I believed was a genuine therapeutic relationship, only to discover it was an elaborate manipulation designed to extract maximum payment from my insurance and personal resources. Recovery required rebuilding my understanding of authentic relationships versus manufactured intimacy. I began working with a legitimate therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who helped me recognize the warning signs I had missed. She explained how predatory practitioners exploit the natural human need for connection and understanding, creating artificial bonds that feel real but serve only their financial interests. The legal process proved equally challenging. While I successfully recovered most of my financial losses, the emotional toll of depositions and court proceedings reopened wounds I was trying to heal. My attorney, Margaret Torres, was instrumental in building a case that not only addressed my situation, but contributed to broader regulatory changes in mental health oversight. Perhaps most significantly, this experience taught me about the difference between genuine vulnerability and manufactured dependency. Dr. Hartwell had systematically encouraged my reliance on our sessions while discouraging my natural support systems. Real healing, I learned, involves building independence and resilience, not creating deeper dependence on a single relationship. The investigation revealed that Dr. Hartwell had employed similar tactics with dozens of other clients, particularly those dealing with loneliness, relationship issues, or major life transitions. The pattern was consistent, excessive session frequency, inappropriate personal disclosure, manufactured crises that required immediate attention, and gradual isolation from other support systems. Today, I work as an advocate for therapy regulation and consumer protection in mental health services. My experience, while painful, provided valuable insights into how vulnerable individuals can be protected from exploitation. I speak at professional conferences and contribute to training programs that help legitimate therapists recognize and report unethical colleagues. The scars remain, but they serve as reminders of my resilience and capacity for growth. I've learned to trust my instincts, maintain healthy boundaries, and seek multiple perspectives when making important decisions about my mental health care. Most importantly, I've discovered that genuine healing comes not from dependence on any single relationship, but from building a diverse network of authentic connections and developing internal resources for managing life's challenges. This journey from victim to advocate represents more than personal recovery. It's a commitment to ensuring others don't face similar exploitation. Every day brings new purpose as I work to strengthen the systems designed to protect those seeking help during their most vulnerable moments.